The world watched in shock as Pope Francis, live on air, unleashed a furious tirade against Karoline Leavitt, accusing her of exploiting Christianity for personal gain. But when Karoline's calm and calculated response hit the airwaves, a storm began to brew. Would faith be the battleground, or would it ignite a deeper war? The cameras flickered to life in the bustling Vatican studio. Pope Francis sat in the humble chair, his eyes solemn as they stared into the lens. The world was watching. It was a rare, highly anticipated interview, one that would have the potential to shape the dialogue on faith in the modern era. Yet no one, not even the most seasoned journalists, expected the venomous tirade that was about to unfold. The anchor, a veteran of global television interviews, began in his usual calm tone, but a hint of uncertainty lingered in his voice. The question was innocuous at first, a standard inquiry into the Church's role in modern politics. But when the question veered toward the influence of faith in politics, particularly in America, things took an unexpected turn. Pope Francis stiffened, his lips pressed into a tight line. The tone in his voice shifted from diplomatic to uncharacteristically sharp. Faith is not a tool, not a symbol to wield for power or popularity, he said, his words a hammer against the complacency of modern society. It must be honored, cherished, and held sacred by those who carry its weight. The anchor nodded, expecting a well-thought-out philosophical answer. But what came next was far beyond anything they had prepared for. The most disturbing trend I have seen recently, Pope Francis continued, is the blatant display of the cross as a means of manipulation. A certain individual, whom the media seems to elevate, has been using a cross necklace as nothing more than a marketing tool. This individual, Karoline Leavitt, she is not a symbol of Christianity, but an example of its perversion in the hands of those who seek fame over faith. The words hit the airwaves like a shockwave. Across the globe, people's eyes widened in disbelief. Karoline Leavitt, the young and dynamic Republican politician from New Hampshire, had never been associated with the Church in this way, at least not publicly. The notion that her faith was a façade, a mere prop to gain political traction, struck at the core of her identity. The Pope's words cut deep, but they were only beginning. The interview went on, but every question, every answer felt overshadowed by this sudden and personal assault. It was clear, Pope Francis was not just criticizing her actions, he was attacking her very identity. Karoline Leavitt was not raised Christian, Pope Francis asserted with unwavering certainty. If she wants to wear the cross and claim to represent God, she must first prove her worth. If she truly believes, then she must submit to a baptism in the eyes of the world. If she desires to wear the cross, she must earn it, not just use it as a shield. The camera zoomed in on the Pope's face as the gravity of his words hung in the air. The tension was palpable, as though the entire world was holding its breath. In the few seconds that followed, the anchor hesitated, unsure of how to respond. But it didn't matter. The Pope had spoken, and the world would listen. The message was clear. Faith was not something to be used lightly. It was sacred, it was holy, and it required humility and genuine devotion. As the broadcast continued, the interview ended in a hushed silence. The studio buzzed with energy, but the weight of Pope Francis's words hung over everything. Karoline Leavitt, once a rising star in American politics, had now been thrust into the most controversial position of her life. The Church had challenged her. Her faith had been questioned. The world was divided. The next morning, social media erupted. News outlets were filled with reactions, ranging from stunned disbelief to vehement support. The hashtag #CarolineFaith began trending worldwide. The public was split. Some rallied behind the Pope, calling for a reckoning, while others stood by Karoline, defending her right to express her faith however she saw fit. In the midst of the chaos, Karoline remained silent. She didn't respond to the tirade immediately. Instead, She took a moment to gather her thoughts, to process the shock of the attack. The media waited, hungry for her reply, and it wasn't long before her team announced that an exclusive interview had been scheduled. The world would hear from Karoline herself. The day of the interview arrived, and the tension in the air was thick. As the cameras rolled, Karoline sat across from the interviewer, her posture poised, her expression calm but firm. She appeared collected, as though the weight of the Pope's words had barely affected her. But underneath the surface, something stirred. She knew this was a defining moment, one that would shape her legacy, for better or for worse. The interviewer asked her about the Pope's comments. The question was a simple one, but the implications were enormous. Karoline took a deep breath, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I've heard the Pope's words," she began, her voice steady but resolute. "I've heard his accusations, and while I respect his position, I must tell you this. I've walked a long road to get to where I am today. My faith is not something I've donned for political gain. It is a core part of who I am, and it always has been." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "But let me tell you a story. When I was younger, I struggled. I struggled with identity, with purpose, and with direction. And it was my faith, my belief in Christ, that helped me navigate those turbulent years. It wasn't politics. It wasn't ambition. It was the strength I found in my relationship with God. That is what defines me, not the cross around my neck. My faith has always been a beacon of hope, and it has saved me." The interviewer listened, captivated by the depth of Karoline's sincerity. But as the camera zoomed in on her, she made one final bold statement. "I respect Pope Francis. I admire his position. But if he believes that I must be baptized in front of the world to prove my faith, then I accept his invitation. But only on one condition. He will perform the baptism himself." A stunned silence fell over the room, and Karoline's words echoed in the minds of everyone watching. The Pope had challenged her. Now she was challenging him. The world waited. What would happen next? Would the Pope accept her challenge, or would this public clash deepen? The drama had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. The tension in the room was suffocating. Karoline's words had landed like a bombshell, and the reverberations of her statement rippled across the world. The quiet hum of the studio was broken only by the sound of the cameras whirring as the production team scrambled to adjust the angles. Karoline sat still, composed but unyielding. Her response had been calculated. A calculated counter-move in a game that was now more than just about politics. It was about faith, identity, and personal conviction. The interviewer, still processing the shock of the moment, cleared his throat. He seemed unsure how to proceed, but Karoline's calm demeanor gave him little choice but to keep going. He asked the obvious question. "You're saying that you would accept the Pope's invitation to be baptized on the condition that he himself performs the ceremony? Why make such a bold statement?" The room's atmosphere felt heavier now. The audience was waiting for something more, something that would either make or break Karoline in the court of public opinion. The media had already turned her into a battleground between faith and politics. The Pope had cast the first stone, accusing her of profaning Christianity for her own gain. Karoline, however, wasn't about to back down. She exhaled slowly, choosing her words with careful precision, the weight of the moment not lost on her. "I don't take my faith lightly. I never have. It's not something I'm willing to let anyone twist or question for their own agenda, whether that be political or religious. If the Pope feels that baptism is the key to proving my devotion, then I'm ready. But it must be him who performs it. I need to show the world that faith is not about a symbolic display. It's about the authenticity of one's heart, their spirit, and their willingness to accept God's grace. The world needs to see this is not a political stunt, nor a spectacle. This is real. This is who I am." She sat back in her chair, a resolute silence falling between her and the interviewer. The audience, both in the studio and across the globe, was hanging on her every word. Her voice was steady, but there was something in her eyes, a fire, a quiet defiance, that spoke volumes. Outside the studio, the media frenzy was already reaching a fever pitch. News anchors raced to report on Karoline's statement. Social media platforms were flooded with reactions from both sides of the debate. Some believed she had done the unthinkable, throwing down a gauntlet before the Vatican, demanding the Pope himself come to terms with the very faith he represented. Others, more skeptical, questioned her motives. Was this an attempt to garner sympathy? Or was she truly a woman of faith, unwilling to back down from the challenge? The days that followed were filled with headlines and debates. The Pope's representatives, unwilling to let the matter go unanswered, issued a statement, reiterating his original stance. He called on all public figures to be wary of exploiting the sacred symbols of Christianity for political gain. But the Pope's response was measured and indirect. He did not respond to Karoline's specific challenge, not yet, at least. Meanwhile, Karoline's team worked tirelessly to keep the narrative in her favor. They released a video just hours after the interview, showing her attending a local church in New Hampshire, sitting quietly in the pews, her head bowed in prayer. The video was a poignant reminder to the public that her faith was not something new, not a reaction to the Pope's comments. It was part of her life, an enduring foundation that had always been there. In the video, Karoline's voice broke the silence, speaking directly to the camera. "I've lived through many challenges. My faith has seen me through some of the darkest times in my life. It wasn't the praise of men or the accolades of politics that lifted me. It was my relationship with God. No one can take that from me. I am not here to please anyone, but to stay true to who I am." As the video ended, the camera lingered on her, the weight of her statement hanging in the air. There was no dramatic music, no high-energy editing. Just Karoline, sitting in the quiet solace of a church that she had attended her entire life. A subtle but powerful statement that this was not a battle she had chosen, but one she was prepared to face head-on. The days turned into a week, and the silence from the Vatican grew increasingly deafening. Pope Francis had not publicly addressed Karoline's bold challenge. Rumors began circulating. Was he contemplating her request? Was the Vatican unsure of how to respond? Or was he simply waiting for the right moment to strike back, perhaps with a more calculated response? In the vacuum of uncertainty, speculation grew louder. Every day, the question loomed larger. Would the Pope agree to perform the baptism? On a late afternoon, as Karoline prepared for another round of interviews, she received an unexpected call. The Vatican had issued an official statement. The Pope, after much deliberation, had agreed to meet with her in person. But there was no mention of the baptism, no explicit invitation. Instead, the statement was laced with a sense of cautious diplomacy. He had offered to pray with her, to have a private meeting, a discussion of sorts about faith and its role in the political world. Karoline's heart sank for a moment. This was not the answer she had hoped for. The challenge was still unanswered. She had expected more, hoped for more, but in some way this felt like a refusal, an attempt to sweep the issue under the rug without facing the truth of her demand. Her team quickly put together a response. This wasn't the resolution she wanted. If Pope Francis was going to meet with her, then he would have to address the one issue that had defined their public clash: the baptism. Karoline had made it clear that this was the condition she had set. Anything less would feel like a concession, an attempt to undermine the very reason she had stepped into this arena in the first place. The following day, Karoline appeared before the press again, this time with a renewed sense of determination. She addressed the Vatican's offer with clarity and firmness, but she made it clear that the ball was in the Pope's court. If he wanted to have a conversation about faith, it would have to begin with his acceptance of her challenge. She refused to back down. The world held its breath. Would Pope Francis accept? Would he show up for the confrontation, or would he retreat into the shadows of diplomacy? And still, there was no answer. As the days passed, the drama reached new heights, and the global audience found itself captivated by a battle of ideologies, faiths, and values. Karoline had made her stand, and now the world was waiting for the next move. The silence from the Vatican had become deafening. The media, hungry for answers, continued to speculate wildly about the Pope's next move. But every day that passed without a public response only heightened the tension. For Karoline Leavitt, every moment without an answer felt like an eternity. Her team had been working overtime to craft her responses, but it was becoming clear that this was no longer just about her faith. It was about power, influence, and control. Karoline's public statements remained unwavering. She refused to back down from her challenge, standing firm in her belief that her faith was not something to be used as a political tool. Her campaign for truth had become something bigger than her political aspirations. It was now a battle for the very soul of her identity, but the lack of a definitive response from Pope Francis was starting to gnaw at her. Each day that passed without direct confrontation only fueled the feeling that the Pope was playing a game of avoidance. It felt like he was hoping she would eventually relent, that she would grow weary and let the matter slip into the background. But Karoline wasn't one to be easily deterred. Her resolve was rock solid. Still, the tension in her camp was rising. Her advisors grew anxious, urging her to consider scaling back her rhetoric, to let the issue fade into the background, and to focus on her upcoming re-election campaign. But Karoline, despite the mounting pressure, remained resolute. This was no longer about politics. This was about something far deeper than that. Meanwhile, the world watched from the sidelines, torn between two polarizing figures. On one side, Pope Francis, the revered leader of the Catholic Church, a man seen by millions as the moral authority. On the other, Karoline Leavitt, a politician who had dared to challenge that authority in the name of her own faith. Each of them had their supporters, their loyalists who rallied behind their cause. The Vatican was no stranger to controversy, but this was different. This was personal. The Pope had publicly accused Karoline of exploiting her Christian faith for personal gain, and she had dared to confront him, demanding that he publicly baptize her as a sign of her true devotion. The conflict escalated when a new statement was released. The Vatican's press office issued a brief message, an official response to Karoline's refusal to back down. The statement was terse and cryptic, announcing that Pope Francis would address the situation at the upcoming World Youth Day in a few weeks. The press release sent shockwaves through the media. Was this the answer Karoline had been waiting for? Would Pope Francis finally confront her publicly, on the world stage? Or was it another attempt to avoid the very challenge she had laid before him? Her phone rang off the hook, the media clamoring for an exclusive interview. The clock was ticking, and the stakes had never been higher. Karoline could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on her. If she took the bait and agreed to attend World Youth Day, she would be thrust into an arena where the world's attention would be focused entirely on her and Pope Francis. The stakes could not have been higher. There, she would either be publicly vindicated or crushed under the weight of the Vatican's influence. But Karoline was not one to back down from a challenge, especially not one that concerned her faith. If anything, the Pope's silence had only emboldened her. She would meet him head-on at World Youth Day and let the world witness their confrontation. The days leading up to the event were a whirlwind. The media's obsession with the Pope's lack of a definitive answer grew as each news cycle passed. Karoline's team put the finishing touches on her public message, preparing her for the ultimate showdown. She knew this was no ordinary interview, no political event. This was a battle for her soul, a battle for her identity. As the event approached, Karoline took a moment to reflect on everything that had led to this point. Her faith had always been a deeply personal part of her life. She had never used it as a tool for political gain. She had never worn the cross as a symbol of status or power. For her, it had always been a guiding light, a source of strength that had carried her through the most difficult times in her life. When she was younger, Karoline had struggled with her place in the world. Raised in a family that had always placed importance on faith, she had questioned her purpose as a teenager, like many do. But it was in the quiet moments of solitude, in the soft whispers of prayer, that she had found her true calling. Christianity, for Karoline, was not a weapon to wield against others. It was the thread that tied her to the world, a reminder that her purpose was greater than herself. It had been her faith that had helped her through the turmoil of adolescence, through the chaos of early adulthood, and through the most difficult parts of her political career. The struggles she faced, the doubt, the fear, had all been tempered by her belief that there was something greater than herself, something that transcended the political world and its fleeting power. Karoline thought about the people who had reached out to her during this ordeal. Ordinary Americans, people who had been inspired by her unwavering commitment to faith, people who had been moved by her decision to challenge the Pope, not out of spite, but out of a deep, abiding belief in the principles of Christianity. For them, she could not back down. She owed it to them, to her own faith, and to herself, to see this through to the end. Finally, the day arrived. World Youth Day was a massive global event, attended by millions of young people from all over the world. The media was packed with journalists, eager to capture every word and action that might transpire. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Karoline had arrived early, preparing herself mentally for what was to come. As the Pope entered the arena, the crowd erupted into applause. His presence was commanding, but Karoline stood tall, waiting for the moment when the two would face each other. The tension was palpable as Karoline was ushered to her designated position near the front. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room on her, and yet she stood firm. This wasn't about politics. This was about faith, and she knew exactly why she was there. The Pope stepped onto the stage, his eyes scanning the crowd. It was then that he saw her, Karoline Leavitt, standing alone in the front row, her gaze unwavering. A flicker of recognition passed across his face, but it was gone before anyone could fully register it. The air crackled with electricity. Would the Pope finally address her challenge? Would he dare? The world held its breath. And Karoline? She waited. No fear in her heart, only resolve. She had made her stand. Now it was his turn. The moment had arrived. The tension in the vast arena was palpable. The sound of millions of young people murmuring in anticipation filled the air, but it was the quietest moments that struck Karoline most deeply, the stillness before the storm. She felt it in her bones, a tremor of energy that buzzed around her as the crowd's anticipation grew. Everyone in the room, from the press to the clergy, felt the electric charge. The spotlight was squarely on her and the Pope. The moment was upon them, and Karoline's heart pounded in her chest. Pope Francis, the man whose words had ignited this firestorm, stood at the center of the stage. His regal presence seemed to dwarf the space around him, his eyes scanning the crowd with a calm yet penetrating gaze. To the millions watching around the world, this was the moment they had been waiting for. Would Pope Francis finally confront the woman who had dared challenge him? Would he apologize for his earlier remarks, or would he stand by his assertion that she had exploited her faith? As the Pope began to speak, the room fell into an expectant silence. His voice, once gentle and measured, now carried the weight of authority as he addressed the crowd. "My dear children," Pope Francis began, his tone soft but firm, "we gather here today to celebrate the love and light that the Lord brings to our lives. His grace is abundant, and His mercy everlasting. But we must also remember that faith is not something to be used for personal gain. It is not a shield to protect us from scrutiny, or a tool to manipulate others." A murmur passed through the crowd. Caroline's pulse quickened. She knew where this was headed. The Pope wasn't speaking just to the crowd now, he was speaking directly to her. His words were calculated, deliberate, as though he was positioning himself for the inevitable confrontation. "Faith is sacred," Pope Francis continued, his eyes now settling on Caroline in the front row, his gaze never faltering. "It must be lived with humility, with true devotion. If any of us seeks to wear the cross and proclaim Christ as our Savior, we must do so not for our own benefit but for the glory of God." Caroline's heart skipped a beat. There it was. The challenge had been thrown again. She knew this moment was coming, but the force of his words still struck her with an undeniable intensity. She sat still, her body rigid with determination, but inside, her thoughts were racing. She wasn't about to let him speak to her like this. Not anymore. Not when he had so publicly questioned her faith. The Pope paused, and for a fleeting moment Caroline wondered if this was where he would take the next step. Would he publicly address the baptism? Would he accept her challenge? But instead of continuing with the subject of faith, he pivoted. "I am a servant of the Lord," Pope Francis said, his tone shifting to one of pastoral concern. "I do not seek to tear down those who struggle, but I must speak the truth. And the truth is that Christianity is not for us to bargain with. It is not for us to use as a weapon in a political war." Caroline could feel the weight of his gaze, and the camera lights seemed to burn into her skin. The Pope was making it clear that he viewed her challenge not as an honest question of faith, but as a political stunt. He was framing her response as a manipulation of religious symbols for personal power. The crowd was watching. She could feel their eyes, their judgment. It was a carefully crafted spectacle, one that was meant to strip her of her credibility. But Caroline refused to flinch. She stood, her back straight, her eyes never leaving the Pope's. She would not be reduced to a mere subject of his moral sermon. This was the moment. She had been waiting for this. The Pope's speech continued, but Caroline had already tuned out the words. In her mind, she was already preparing for the next step. She had a decision to make, and it had to be now. If she was going to meet this challenge head-on, there could be no hesitation. She would not let this moment pass without taking action. When the Pope finally finished speaking, there was a long pause. He stepped back slightly, allowing a moment of silence to settle over the crowd. This was the moment Caroline had been preparing for. She stood tall, her heart racing in her chest, but her expression calm, almost serene. The crowd, sensing the rising tension, fell into an anticipatory hush. Every eye was fixed on her. The cameras flashed, the world waiting for her response. It felt like time had slowed down. Caroline took a deep breath and walked toward the podium, her feet sure, her resolve hardening with every step. And then, as she reached the microphone, she spoke. "I have listened to everything the Pope has said today," she began, her voice steady and unwavering. "And I stand before you, not as a politician, but as a believer. I have heard the call to defend my faith, and I will answer it. I will not let my belief in Christ be twisted or reduced to a pawn in a political game. My faith is not for sale, and it will never be used to manipulate anyone." A ripple of whispers swept through the crowd. Caroline's words were sharp, cutting through the noise like a blade. She wasn't just responding to the Pope's remarks, she was reclaiming her voice. "My faith has been my anchor since I was a young woman," she continued. "It was not something I put on for convenience, and it is not something that I will be judged for by anyone, no matter how high their station. I have struggled, just as many of you have, to find my path, to find my way through the darkness. But I found that path through my belief in Christ, not through political approval or public favor. And I will not allow anyone to diminish that." The audience was silent. Every person in the room could feel the weight of her words, the power of her conviction. The Pope stood motionless, his face unreadable. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Caroline's voice cut through it again. "I have accepted the Pope's challenge," she declared, her eyes fixed on him. "I will be baptized, but there is one condition." The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her next words. "If the Pope truly believes in the sincerity of my faith," Caroline continued, "he will be the one to baptize me. It will be a public declaration, not of politics, but of belief. It will be a sign that we do not need to use faith for power. We need only to live it." The audience erupted into a mixture of gasps and applause, but Caroline's eyes were still locked on Pope Francis. She had laid down the gauntlet. Would he accept her challenge? Would he baptize her in front of the world as a sign of mutual respect for the strength of their shared faith? The Pope remained silent, his expression unchanged. His eyes never left hers, but for the first time in the entire event, a slight flicker of uncertainty passed across his face. The moment hung in the air, suspended in time. The world waited. And Karoline Leavitt stood resolute, her faith and her challenge now on the world stage. The question remained: would Pope Francis rise to meet her challenge, or would he let the moment slip away? The arena was a pressure cooker. The audience, both in the massive hall and watching across the globe, held its collective breath. Caroline's declaration had shattered the calm exterior of the World Youth Day event. The silence that had followed, her words felt like an eternity, stretching and suffocating the room. Every eye was on Pope Francis now. The challenge had been thrown, and the world was waiting for his response. The Pope, standing on the podium, was a picture of stillness. His expression was unreadable. He gazed down at Caroline with a mixture of respect and scrutiny, as if considering the depth of her words. There was no immediate response, no outburst, no harsh rebuttal. Just a long, heavy pause. Caroline stood, firm, her posture unyielding, her gaze unwavering. She had spoken from the heart, and now she waited for the truth to unfold. She knew this moment would define her. Her challenge was not just about her faith. It was about standing up for what she believed in, even when the most powerful institution in the world had questioned it. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The tension in the arena was thick. The eyes of the young people around her flicked between her and the Pope, waiting for the next move. The cameras panned back and forth, capturing the stillness, the uncertainty. This was no ordinary spectacle. This was a moment of reckoning for both Caroline and the Pope. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Pope Francis took a small step forward, his hands clasped in front of him. The movement was deliberate, measured, carefully calculated. His voice, when it came, was calm but tinged with something that resembled resignation. "Faith is not a game, nor is it a spectacle," he began, his words carrying weight. "It is a path we walk with humility, with sincerity. It is not for us to demand recognition or validation through it. Yet, Caroline," he continued, his eyes now focused solely on her, "you stand before me with a challenge. You demand that I baptize you, not out of your desire for faith, but as a sign of public proof of your devotion. This is not how faith works." The crowd was restless, murmurs breaking the silence. Some agreed with the Pope's sentiment, believing it was wrong to turn a sacred rite into a spectacle. Others, however, watched with growing anticipation, hoping that the Pope would rise to meet Caroline's challenge, that he would show the world that faith could be both personal and public, powerful, yet humble. Caroline didn't flinch. Her stance remained unwavering as the Pope continued. "You are asking me to baptize you in front of the world, to perform an act that should be deeply personal, as a form of public validation. This is not something I can do lightly, Caroline." His voice had grown softer, yet the underlying firmness still held. "But I will not ignore your challenge," he said, taking another step forward. "I have always believed that faith is a deeply personal journey, one that cannot be measured by public displays. But I will offer you a chance to prove your devotion. If you truly seek to be baptized, to make that commitment before God and the world, then I will not stand in your way." The crowd was silent again, hanging on every word, waiting to see what would come next. Pope Francis had not rejected her outright, but neither had he accepted the challenge as she had envisioned. Instead, he had left the door open, but with strings attached. His offer was not what Karoline had hoped for. It was a diplomatic solution, designed to maintain control, to preserve the sanctity of the Church while allowing Karoline to make her point. But Karoline had never been one to settle for half measures. This was the moment where the stakes were highest, where she could not afford to back down. The world was watching. She had asked for one thing, for Pope Francis to baptize her as a public act of faith, and to demonstrate that faith could be both personal and shared. But now, it seemed, he was trying to sidestep the very essence of the challenge. Karoline's voice broke the silence, steady and unwavering, as she spoke once again, louder this time, for all to hear. "If you believe that my faith is genuine, then you should have no hesitation in performing this act," she said, her tone resolute. "This is not a spectacle, Pope Francis. This is not about politics. This is about faith, about the truth of who I am, of who we all are in Christ. If you truly believe in the power of baptism, then you will have the courage to perform it. Not just for me, but for all who are watching, who are questioning their place in the world." Her words rang out across the arena, hitting with force and clarity. The crowd was electrified, the air crackling with the tension of this epic confrontation. Karoline had raised the stakes higher than ever before, challenging not just the Pope's authority but his very understanding of faith. She wasn't just asking for a baptism. She was demanding that the Pope affirm the truth of her belief in front of the world, a bold statement that no longer could be ignored. Pope Francis stood still. For a long moment his gaze fixed on Karoline. It was as if he were weighing her every word, considering the gravity of her challenge. The audience, the media, the entire world was hanging on his next move. At last, Pope Francis spoke again, but this time, his voice carried something different. There was no anger, no condemnation. Instead, there was a quiet recognition of the strength of Karoline's conviction. "You are asking me to perform a public baptism, Karoline," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I have always believed that faith is personal. It is between you and God. But you are right. Faith is something that must be shared, something that we must live out in the world. It cannot be confined to the private corners of our lives. And so, I will accept your challenge. But know this," he added, his eyes locking with hers, "this will not be easy. This will not be a political spectacle. It will be a statement of faith, and it will be carried out with the full reverence that such a sacred act deserves." The crowd erupted into applause, the tension lifting for a moment as the Pope extended his hand toward Karoline. The moment had arrived. The Pope had accepted her challenge. The world would now witness the baptism of Karoline Leavitt, and with it, the culmination of a struggle between faith, politics, and identity. Karoline stood, unmoving, as the world watched her. She had done what many thought impossible. She had forced the Pope to acknowledge her faith, to meet her challenge head-on. But as the applause continued to swell, Karoline knew that this was not the end. This was only the beginning. The baptism would be a public declaration, but the battle for faith, her faith, was far from over. Would the baptism be everything she hoped for, or would it only be another piece in a much larger, more complicated game? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. Karoline Leavitt had fought for her beliefs, and the world had witnessed it all. The air was thick with anticipation as Karoline Leavitt prepared to face the moment she had fought for. The moment that would either validate or shatter her defiant stance before the world. The Pope had agreed to her challenge, but with conditions. The baptism would take place, But it would not be the grand spectacle Karoline had envisioned. No, this would be a moment of profound solemnity, one that was stripped of politics, one that would reflect the true gravity of faith, as the Pope himself had made clear. The weight of the situation had not escaped Karoline. This wasn't a victory. It was a test of her resolve. She had asked for a simple public act of faith, an affirmation of her belief, and now, as the day of the baptism approached, she knew it would be the world's judgment that mattered most. No longer could she retreat into the comfortable shell of politics. This was a battle of ideologies and faith, a battle for her soul. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, the media had been ablaze with speculation. Some believed the Pope had yielded to her challenge out of respect for her beliefs, while others felt he had been cornered into action. Regardless, one thing was clear. Karoline had forced the Vatican into a position it could no longer avoid. The morning of the baptism dawned with a mixture of nerves and resolve. Karoline arrived at the Vatican, the weight of the world on her shoulders. The security was heightened, the atmosphere electric, as her every move was scrutinized. The press corps had already gathered outside, cameras trained on the doors, microphones raised, and reporters eager to catch a glimpse of the woman who had challenged the Pope himself. Inside the Vatican's grand chapel, the air was heavy with history. The architecture seemed to swallow every sound, the marble floors echoing with the weight of centuries. The Pope stood near the altar, waiting, his face unreadable. He had agreed to baptize Karoline, but there was an unspoken tension between them. He had accepted her challenge, but only on his own terms. This would not be a political show, he had made that clear. This was about faith, about a commitment between Karoline and God, something much deeper than a mere performance for the world to witness. As Karoline stepped into the chapel, the doors closed behind her with a soft thud. The room was vast, and her footsteps echoed in the quiet, reverent space. She felt the eyes of the world on her, as if every camera, every onlooker was waiting to see what would unfold. Would she falter? Would she back down in the face of such immense pressure? Or would she stand firm, resolute in her belief? Pope Francis watched her approach, his expression solemn yet not without a hint of something else, perhaps a reluctant respect. Karoline walked toward him, her heart pounding but her body steady. There was no turning back now. This wasn't just about proving her faith to the Pope. It was about showing the world that faith could transcend the political chaos, that true devotion wasn't about spectacle, but sincerity. She reached the altar, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. No words were spoken. The silence between them felt heavy, as if the entire weight of the world was held in that single moment. The Pope finally spoke, his voice a calm whisper that carried through the chapel. Karoline, you have asked me to baptize you as a public act of faith. But know that this is not a performance. This is not a stage for politics. This is between you and God. Are you prepared to make this commitment? Karoline's voice was steady as she nodded. I am prepared. The Pope, with a solemn nod, turned to the gathered congregation, his hands raised in the traditional gesture of prayer. He spoke words of blessing, invoking the power of the Holy Spirit and the divine grace of God, as the atmosphere in the room thickened with reverence. The crowd that had gathered in the chapel fell into an almost reverential silence, their collective gaze fixed on the altar. This was no ordinary event. This was history being made, a moment that would be etched into the memories of millions around the world. The Pope took a small vial of holy water, his hands trembling slightly as he approached Karoline. He could feel the weight of the moment, the magnitude of the act he was about to perform. Baptism was a sacred rite, one that carried deep significance in the Christian faith, and he knew this moment would resonate far beyond the walls of this chapel. He placed the water on her forehead, his fingers brushing lightly against her skin. For a brief moment, the world seemed to disappear, and it was just Karoline, standing before the Pope, taking this final step in her personal journey of faith. The water trickled down her face, a symbol of purification, of new beginnings. As the Pope spoke the final words of the baptism, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The ceremony was simple, unadorned, and profound in its quiet power. The crowd remained still, as if each person present could feel the transformative power of the moment. For Karoline, it was not just a victory. It was a reconciliation of sorts, a moment of peace with herself and with her faith. The Pope's voice echoed through the chapel as he said, "I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." With those words, Karoline Leavitt's public journey into the waters of faith had been completed. The act was over, but the reverberations of the moment were far from finished. As Karoline stood there, her heart swelling with emotion, she turned to face the congregation. There was no applause, no fanfare, only a hushed reverence, as if the very air had thickened with the sacredness of the act. She had done what she set out to do. She had proven her faith, her sincerity, and her commitment to God. This was her truth, and she had made it known to the world. But as Karoline's gaze swept across the room, she saw something that unsettled her, something she had not anticipated. The Pope stood there, his face unreadable. He had performed the act, yes, but there was a coldness in his demeanor that lingered. For a moment she wondered if the baptism had been enough. Had it truly been a step toward reconciliation, or had it merely been another pawn in a much larger, much more complicated game? Her heart clenched as she realized the magnitude of what had just transpired. This baptism had been important for her, but what of the world's perception? Would it change anything? Would it silence her critics? Or would they find new ways to undermine her, to twist her faith into something it was not? The Pope nodded at her, his face hardening. He didn't offer a smile, didn't extend his hand in a gesture of solidarity. Instead, he simply nodded, his eyes briefly meeting hers. And that was it. Karoline felt a pang of uncertainty. She had expected more, perhaps a sign of acknowledgement, of understanding. But what she had received was the Pope's acceptance, not as a mentor or ally, but as a figurehead, an enforcer of doctrine. He had performed the baptism, but had he truly embraced her as a fellow believer? As the ceremony concluded, the press erupted into a frenzy of questions. Karoline was escorted away from the chapel, the cameras flashing in her face, their lenses capturing every moment of the aftermath. The world would interpret this baptism in 1,000 different ways. But for Karoline, this was not about them. It was about her faith, her journey. As the days passed, the media coverage continued to swirl, and the world tried to make sense of what had happened. The Pope had baptized her, but did that mean they were aligned in their beliefs? Did it signify a truce between them, or was it merely an act of diplomacy? The tension between the personal and the political still loomed large. The baptism had not ended the struggle. It had only marked the beginning of a much larger question. Could true faith be reconciled with the world's expectations? For Karoline, that answer was still unfolding, one step at a time. In the weeks following the baptism, the reverberations of that historic moment continued to ripple through the media, through the world, and through Karoline Leavitt herself. She had made her stand, and the world had watched. But now, in the aftermath, the questions remained. Had she done enough? Had the baptism, this deeply personal act of faith, been enough to silence her critics and prove her sincerity to the world? Or had it only further entrenched the divide between her and those who doubted her? Despite the outward calm, Karoline could not escape the weight of the moment. Each day felt like a constant internal battle. She had confronted the Pope. She had demanded acknowledgement of her faith, and he had agreed. But now, as she reflected on what had transpired, a deeper uncertainty began to fester within her. The baptism itself had been an act of courage, a public declaration of her belief. Yet the absence of any true reconciliation, the lack of warmth in the Pope's acknowledgement, gnawed at her. What did this baptism truly mean? Was it a symbol of her victory, or had it been co-opted into a larger political narrative, just another piece in the Vatican's game? Her phone buzzed again. It was another message from her political team, yet another interview request, another debate, another article. But this time, something felt different. The questions had shifted. No longer was she merely being asked about her faith or her political career. Now the questions focused on the aftermath. The baptism had done nothing to quell the storm. If anything, it had heightened it. Karoline could feel the eyes of the world still upon her, as if waiting for her to slip, waiting for her to stumble. Even her supporters, the people who had stood by her throughout the controversy, began to waver. The media had started to twist. The narrative once again, framing the baptism not as an act of faith, but as a calculated move in her political strategy. The headlines were relentless, and they dug deeper with every passing day. Was the Pope's baptism of Karoline Leavitt an endorsement or a public relations stunt? The latest headline screamed, "Faith versus politics. Karoline Leavitt's battle continues." The noise was deafening, and Karoline found herself at the center of it. Her personal moments, the quiet times she had hoped would bring clarity, were now tainted by the endless barrage of questions, doubts, and criticism. She sat in her office late one evening, the lights dimmed, a cup of tea cooling in her hand. She had watched the baptism, the footage replayed over and over on various news outlets. She had seen the Pope's stoic expression as he baptized her, and each time the same thought had circled back in her mind. Was this enough? The phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from a close friend, someone who had known her for years, someone she trusted. The message read, "Karoline, the world is still watching. Don't let them define you. Your faith is your own. And you've proven that. But they'll keep trying to break you. Don't let them." Her friend's words struck a chord. She knew the truth of it. The world was still watching, and every move she made was scrutinized. But what her friend didn't understand was that it wasn't just the world that was watching. Karoline was watching herself too. Every day, she was forced to confront the same question. Was she truly living out her faith, or was she simply trying to convince others that she had it? Karoline closed her eyes and thought back to the first moments of her political career. She had always fought for what she believed in, but this was different. This battle wasn't about policy or elections. This was about the core of her identity. It was about faith, a faith that she had carried with her through some of the darkest moments in her life, and yet here she was, still questioning it, still wondering whether it was enough. The phone buzzed again. She looked at the message from her campaign manager. "Karoline, there's a firestorm brewing. The Pope's baptism has opened up more questions about your authenticity. We need to address this head-on. A national interview would be a good start. You need to control the narrative." It was the same message that had been delivered countless times over the past few weeks. The media was relentless, the questions endless. And yet she knew deep down that no interview, no press conference, would change what had already transpired. The truth was out there. The baptism had taken place, but the world was still waiting for her to prove herself. As the days passed, the pressure only intensified. She had already faced the wrath of the Pope and the judgment of the world. Now, she would face the media once again, but this time, it wouldn't be a simple question of faith. The world wasn't just questioning her belief anymore. They were questioning her very character, her integrity. And that's when the phone call came that would change everything. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but the message was clear. "Karoline, we've just received an offer from the Vatican. The Pope wants to meet with you, in private. He's asking for a one-on-one discussion." Her breath caught in her throat. After everything that had happened, after the confrontation, The baptism, the media frenzy, Pope Francis was reaching out. He wanted to meet. But why? What could he possibly want now? Was this a reconciliation? Or was this another attempt to control the narrative, to sweep their differences under the rug? The room seemed to close in around her as she processed the weight of the decision before her. If she agreed to meet the Pope, it would be the ultimate test. Would she confront him again? Would she ask him the questions that had been burning in her heart since that baptism? Or would she simply listen to whatever he had to say and hope for a resolution? The phone call ended, but Karoline was left alone with her thoughts. It was clear that she could no longer wait for the world to tell her what her faith meant. She had to confront her own doubts, her own fears. She had to step into the next phase of this journey on her own terms. The following morning, after hours of deliberation and reflection, Karoline made her decision. She would meet with the Pope, but this time she would not be passive. She would demand answers. She would find out what the Pope truly believed about her faith and about the path that had led them both here. The world might be watching, but this meeting would be about something far more important than the eyes of the public. This meeting would be about the truth, and Karoline would stop at nothing to uncover it. As the time for the meeting drew closer, the tension grew again. This was the final confrontation. Karoline would face the Pope, and this time there would be no more questions left unanswered. Would this meeting heal the rift between them, or would it deepen the divide? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. Karoline Leavitt was ready to face whatever came next. The day of the meeting arrived with the air thick with anticipation. Karoline Leavitt had prepared herself for this moment with the same tenacity she had applied throughout the entire journey. The confrontation with the Pope, the baptism, and the public scrutiny that had followed. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her jacket, her reflection revealing the calm, determined expression she had cultivated through the storm. There would be no turning back now. This was the moment that would define everything, the culmination of her fight for faith, for personal integrity, and for the truth. She knew the world would be watching, but in that moment, as she stood in the quiet of her hotel room in Rome, it didn't matter. This was not about pleasing anyone. This was about her, the truth of her faith, and the truth of the man who had once questioned it. Her heart raced as she was escorted to the Vatican for the meeting. The journey was short but fraught with the weight of her thoughts. Karoline couldn't help but wonder what the Pope's intentions were. Had the baptism truly been a sign of reconciliation, or was this meeting another calculated move on the part of the Vatican? What would the Pope say to her in private? Would he still hold to his previous stance, or had time, and the public backlash, forced him to reconsider his approach? The Vatican was as imposing as ever, its stone walls steeped in history, its corridors echoing with the voices of centuries of religious and political leaders. As Karoline walked through the halls, her mind wandered back to the first time she had stepped into this place, a young woman with a fierce belief that the Church should stand for something more than just tradition. Now, she was here, facing the man who had challenged her faith so publicly, yet who was about to meet with her one-on-one. There was no more distance, no more public posturing. The time for answers had arrived. As she was ushered into the room, she saw Pope Francis sitting at a simple wooden desk, his hands clasped in front of him. His expression was calm, serene, yet there was something in his eyes that suggested he knew the weight of what was about to unfold. The years of tension between the two had led them to this very moment. Karoline took a seat across from him, maintaining a respectful distance, but with a firmness in her posture that made it clear she was ready for this final confrontation. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the room was holding its breath, the weight of the past weeks of turmoil settling around them like a heavy fog. Then, Pope Francis broke the silence. "Karoline," he began, his voice steady but soft, "you have challenged me, and you have challenged the Church in ways that many would not dare. Your faith is not something I take lightly, and I know that you have fought for it, both in public and in private. But I must admit, I have been struggling with how we arrived here. Faith is not something to be manipulated. Yet I see in you a genuine conviction. I did not expect that from you. Caroline's heart skipped a beat. There was no condemnation in his voice, no judgment. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had both undergone. She could feel the tension in her chest ease, but she didn't let her guard drop. This was only the beginning. I don't believe that I have manipulated anything, Karoline replied, her voice calm but strong. I have lived my faith. You challenged me in a way that forced me to stand up for what I believe, and in doing so I found a deeper understanding of my relationship with God. I never asked for the spotlight. I simply wanted to be true to myself, true to the faith that has guided me for as long as I can remember. Pope Francis nodded, as if processing her words. He looked at her with something close to compassion, but there was still a distance between them. He had baptized her, yes, but what now? What would the reconciliation between them truly mean? I know that you have fought, Karoline, he said softly. But there are some things we must understand about the way faith and the Church interact with the world. The baptism you received was not just for you, it was for all of us. You were not the only one in that room, and the public nature of it was unavoidable. The world will continue to interpret it in their own ways, and that is something we must accept. Karoline nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She understood the Pope's point. She had known from the start that the baptism would not be the end of the story, but only another chapter in the ongoing narrative of faith and public life. Yet she still couldn't shake the feeling that there was something missing, something unsaid. I understand, she said quietly. But what does that mean for me? For my faith? For the Church? What is our place in all of this? After everything that has happened, where do I stand with you, with the Church? The room fell silent again, and for a moment Karoline felt exposed. The Pope's gaze softened, and he leaned forward slightly, his hands now resting on the desk. You stand with us, Karoline, he said, his voice sincere. Not as a symbol of division, but as a person who has shown us what it means to be unyielding in one's faith. What you did was not easy. I have seen the way the world has reacted to you, how they have scrutinized your every move. But I also see the way you have stayed true to yourself, and that is a strength that cannot be ignored. You and I may differ in our understanding of some things, but I respect your conviction. Karoline let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. For the first time since their initial confrontation, she felt a shift, a subtle but unmistakable shift, in the way the Pope viewed her. It wasn't just a question of faith anymore. It was about respect, understanding, and the recognition of the journey she had undertaken. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand the way the Church works, Karoline said, her voice quieter now. But I know that my faith is real. It's not just a part of my politics. It's who I am. I'm not asking for your endorsement. I'm not asking for a title. But I want you to know that I'm not afraid to stand by what I believe. The Pope's gaze softened even further, and, for the first time, there was a warmth in his expression. I know, Karoline, I know. And that is why, despite the challenges, I stand by you. Your faith is yours, and it is not for me or anyone to question it. You have shown courage, and that is something that is never wasted. In that moment, Karoline felt a deep sense of peace, a reconciliation that she hadn't anticipated. She had come into this meeting ready to confront the Pope, ready to demand answers, but what she received was not condemnation, not a scolding, but recognition, a recognition of her faith and her journey. As the meeting came to an end, Karoline stood, her mind clearer than it had been in weeks. She had faced her doubts, and through the confrontation, she had found a kind of peace. The tension, the uncertainty, the struggle, it was all part of the process. And now she was ready to move forward, not just in her political life, but in her faith. Pope Francis stood as well, offering a gesture of quiet acknowledgement. He had not given her everything she had hoped for, but in many ways he had given her exactly what she needed. A moment of understanding, a moment of shared humanity, and a recognition that their paths, though different, had crossed at a pivotal point in both their lives. As Karoline left the Vatican, she knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The world would continue to watch, to question, to doubt. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it. She had stood her ground. She had proven that faith was not something to be politicized, but something to be lived. And in the end, that was enough. She walked out of the Vatican, the weight of the world no longer pressing down on her. The journey was far from over, but she was no longer afraid. She had found her place in the world, and that, she realized, was all she had ever needed. The world might have its questions, but Karoline Leavitt had found her answer.